Hello all. Today we're going to look at perhaps the most famous rhyme said to have a hidden, dark and sinister meaning. Ring around the rosies, or ring-a-rosies, depending on your preference. What are the origins of the rhyme, and how is it linked to the Black Death? You may not have heard of this theory, in which case stay with me and I'll explore the origins. And if you have heard of it, we'll also look at the extent to which the symptoms of the plague match up with the rhyme. We'll also look at possible other explanations, and why this all really matters. Let's start with the rhyme itself. Now, as you might have guessed, I'm British, so I grew up with a version like this. Ring a rosies, a pocket full of posies, a tissue, we all fall down. However, many of our American cousins recite a slightly different version. Ring around the rosies, a pocket full of posies, ashes, we all fall down. The American version doesn't require sneezing, which is nice, but it also loses the oldie-worldy ring a roses, which I think is a bit of a shame. So let's jump right in and discuss the plague theory. The basic premise is that children sang the rhyme as a warning of the signs and symptoms of plague, specifically at the time of the Great Plague, which struck England in 1665, or, and let's be honest, much less plausibly, during the Black Death, which ravaged much of Europe in the 14th century. There are actually 3 strains of plague, all spread by bacteria. Bubonic plague, which was passed to a human when a person is bitten by a flea found on a rat or other small animal. Septicemic plague, which is most commonly spread through the bacteria entering the body through a break in the skin. And pneumonic plague, which is spread via air droplets from coughs and sneezes. The rhyme suggests the victim's ordeal starts, at least, with them catching bubonic plague. Ring around the roses suggests a red rash around a bubo, which develops initially near the flea bite, and then spreads to the armpit, neck and groin. It's the presence of buboes which gives bubonic plague its name. There is an alternative theory that the ring of roses alludes to a red rash which develops, but a rash is a rather rare side effect of the plague, and a simple rash didn't kill a quarter of the population of the continent of Europe. A pocket full of posies could be one of 2 things. Either you were supposed to carry posies as a way of actually warding off the plague, or alternatively the scent of posies covered up the smell of death. Plague doctors, at least in the 17th century version of the plague, apparently put wild flowers and herbs in their beak-like mask for this purpose. Now it's worth remembering that we're supposed to have a pocket full of posies, but pockets were not put into people's clothes as they are today during the time of the plague, so I assume the posies were supposed to be held in a purse around the belt. Posies are still carried today by the British royal family as a way of hiding the stench of the great unwashed, at least symbolically, when they attend the Maundy Thursday church service. Moving on, a tissue implies sneezing, which almost certainly meant bad news for our patient. The plague had now developed from bubonic plague to pneumonic as the bacteria entered the lungs. While those with bubonic plague might suffer coughing up blood, horrendous pain and gangrene, there was at least a chance they would survive. Today, with modern medicine, there's a 90% survival rate from bubonic plague. Meanwhile, the life expectancy for a victim with pneumonic plague, even today, remains practically nil without treatment and antibiotics. So this would lead to the inevitable patient falling down, dead. In the American version, ashes alludes to the burning of piles of bodies, which, so we are told, was done in some cases in an attempt to reduce the spread of the disease. So that's the theory. But how much truth is there in it? Well, sadly, the level of historic accuracy is directly proportional to the survival rate of pneumonic plague, practically 0. It's not mentioned at all by those who lived through the plague, certainly not the 14th century Black Death version, but equally not during the Great Plague of the 17th century. There's nothing in Samuel Pepys's diary or any of the other various histories. The symptoms don't really match with the rhyme very well, and bodies weren't burnt, they were buried in plague pits. The plague story only really appeared in the mid-20th century, but we've no idea of its origin. We can be fairly sure the rhyme wasn't linked to the plague before the Second World War, as Catherine Elwes Thomas, that purveyor of theories of nursery rhymes who published her Mother Goose book in 1930, makes no mention of it. And anyone who's watched this channel before knows that you can be sure if there was a link, she would have mentioned it. I've added some links to some of her more fanciful ideas on nursery rhymes above. We do know that the plague theory was common by 1950, as Peter and Ioniope, who researched the origin of nursery rhymes, cursed the number of people who quoted to them. So much so, they apparently feared leaving the house. By 1967, a musical was being performed in England about the plague of 1665 called Ring of Roses, and there have been innumerable books and articles written about it. So what on earth is going on? Well, personally, I think the plague theory came about through accumulation of factors. The bacterial causes of plague were first discovered in 1894 by Alexander Yersin. The state's interest in personal hygiene was then amplified by the ravages of the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918. By the Second World War, rhymes were being used to encourage children to avoid sneezing in each other's faces. After all, coughs and sneezes spread diseases, including plague, and the theory of the rhyme being linked to the plague was a useful way of doing this in the playground. The interwar period also saw increased interest in the origins of folklore and nursery rhyme etymology, and theories around Ring Around the Rosies seem to play into this. So what's the real origin of the rhyme? Well, the earliest rhyme talking about rings, roses, and posies is the one referenced in William Wells Newell's Games and Songs of American Children. It was published in 1883, but in it he states that the rhyme dates back to 1790. It runs as follows. Ring a rosy, a pocket full of posies, all the little girls in town run for little Josie. He also gives an alternative. Round a ring of roses, pots full of posies, the one who stoops last shall tell whom she loves best. These early versions are ring games, when children or adults dance in a circle and stoop or curtsy. In traditional European culture, roses and posies often signify joy and love, and that's a lovely thought, rather than being linked with death and disease. The rhyme, pretty much as we know it today, first appeared in Kate Greenaway's Mother Goose in 1881. They're saying hush hush rather than a tissue or tissue, but the children are drawn dancing around in a circle rather than covered in buboes and coughing up blood, which is rather nice. So what do you think my response to all this is? If you follow this channel, you'll have heard I got very agitated over the pseudo-history of Jack and Jill and the Grand Old Duke of York. I also got extremely vexed over Hickory Dickory Dock. So what about this one? Do you think I'm for or against the plague theory? Well, you have fallen right into my trap, Mr. Bond. I am in fact in favour of it. I think to fight for the so-called true origin of the rhyme misses the point. The meaning behind rhymes are often lost in the mists of time, and while it's fun to explore the origins, and after all that's what this channel's all about, what keeps rhymes alive is that each generation creates their own meaning. The plague theory has been taken on by children in the playground, teachers in the classroom, and even historians to tell the story of the Great Plague. Speaking as someone with a PhD in political history, I'm not sure we should be too precious about all this. Anything which brings alive the sheer magnitude and suffering of the plague is a good thing. The Black Death transformed the economy of Europe for centuries. In London in 1665, plague killed over 100,000 people, over a fifth of the city's population. And as well as the scurvy and King's Evil in the weekly death records, you can see that plague was a mass killer. The rhyme has also been used by some of the small villages around England to tell the tale of the impact of the arrival of the plague. The village of Holcombe in Somerset claims to be the origin of the rhyme. It's not. But when the Black Death struck England in 1348, its impact on Holcombe was such that the people buried all the houses, and aside from the church, moved the entire village a mile down the road. For a time, the local pub was named Ring of Roses in remembrance of these events. Interestingly, Holcombe is less than 3 miles from Kilmerston, which claims to be the origin of Jack and Jill, and 10 miles from Mells, which is said to be the basis of Little Jack Horner. These Somerset folk love their nursery rhymes. Similarly, during the Great Plague of 1665-6, the disease made its way in some cloth from London to the remote village of Eyam in Derbyshire. What followed has gone down in legend. As the villagers were struck down, the people, under the leadership of their vicar, enacted a self-imposed quarantine. For 14 months, the village was cut off. Merchants left supplies on marked boundary stones on the edge of the village, and money was left in a hole filled with vinegar to act as disinfectant. It's worth saying that, much like the rhyme itself, the facts about Eyam and the plague are not from contemporary sources and romanticised later, but what is certainly true is by the time the plague abated, 273 of the villagers had succumbed. Today, Ring o' Roses is used as part of the retelling of this tale, and is seen in the stained glass window of the church in an Eyam Plague Museum. So, Ring Around the Roses is not about the plague. It has a long and equally interesting history as a children's playground ring game, but if people want to think of it as a macabre tale, and this increases the interest in how our ancestors lived and died, that's fine by me. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please do consider subscribing, and you'll be notified of future videos. Bye for now.